The auctioneer's hand was shaking. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the ship. Not the crowd of alien bodies packed into the bidding hall of Keth 7 Station, breathing recycled air and whispering to each other in a dozen different languages. Not the blinking red warning signs above Bay Null, or the yellow quarantine tape stretched across the entrance in 6 parallel lines. No. I noticed the auctioneer's hand. The Varathi translator standing beside him noticed I was looking, and quietly moved 3 steps to the left, as if distance from the podium might help. I was holding a paper cup of something warm that the vending unit had called coffee-adjacent beverage. It tasted like burnt metal and regret, which made it fitting, because that was also more or less the story of my financial situation. My name is Elias Vance. I am 34 years old. I am from a mid-sized city in northern England. I have a salvage license rated for light and medium recovery operations, and at the time of this auction I had exactly 43 credits to my name. 3 of those credits were going toward the coffee-adjacent beverage. That left 40. I had not planned to attend the Keth 7 surplus auction. I had planned to pick up a decommissioned cargo loader that a Dreth shipping company had listed for 50 credits, talk them down to 35, and flip it to a repair yard on the outer ring for maybe 80. A profit of 45 credits. Not enough to retire on, but enough to keep my license active for another 6 months. The cargo loader had already sold when I arrived. Someone had bought it before the auction opened, which was either against the rules or a very gray area, and the auctioneer had shrugged one of his 4 shoulders when I asked about it. That was when I had bought the coffee-adjacent beverage and decided to walk the floor, because I had already paid the entry fee, and I was not the kind of person who threw away entry fees. The floor of Keth 7's auction hall was enormous. Bay after bay of salvaged equipment, decommissioned vessels, surplus machinery, and the kind of miscellaneous alien hardware that defied easy classification. I walked past a row of Varathi scout ships, stripped down to their frames. I walked past 3 Dreth freighters that smelled strongly of something chemical and sweet. I walked past a rack of power cells the size of small houses, and then I reached Bay Null. It was not labeled Bay Null on any of the signs. The signs above it read nothing at all. The signs above every other bay had names, numbers, lot designations. This one had a blank panel that might once have held a number, and beneath it, those 6 lines of yellow quarantine tape. Behind the tape, the ship sat in the dark. It was big. Not the biggest ship I had ever seen, but big enough that it filled the bay the way a large animal fills a small cage. The hull was dark gray, almost black in the bay's low light, and it had the kind of shape that said, warship, in a language that required no translation. Angular, deliberate. Every surface looked like it was doing something useful. No wasted curves, no decorative plating, just function, stacked on more function. I stood there for a moment. The alien crowd moved around me, the way water moves around a stone in a river. Nobody stopped to look. Nobody slowed down. They came close to Bay Null, and then drifted sideways, as if an invisible current was nudging them away, and none of them appeared to notice they were doing it. A Varathi child tugged at an adult's limb and pointed toward the ship, and the adult picked the child up, turned around, and walked in the other direction without saying a word. I looked at the auction sheet clipped to the tape. Lot designation, unlisted. Hull designation, SV Kareth. Class designation, Gozanti type heavy cruiser. Condition, unknown. Known history, partial. Previous owners, 3. Current status of previous owners, not on record. Opening bid, no minimum. Reserve price, none. At the very bottom of the sheet, in letters that were slightly larger than the rest, it read, Biohazard status unclassified. Do not board without full containment equipment. Buyer accepts all risk. Station authority accepts no liability. This vessel is sold entirely without warranty or representation of any kind. 40 credits. I thought about that cargo loader I had missed. I thought about my dwindling account balance. I thought about the fact that I was a man with a salvage license and no current salvage to speak of, standing in front of a ship that had no minimum bid and no other interested parties. I thought about the shaking hand of the auctioneer. Then I thought about what a Gozanticlass cruiser was worth in parts alone, if everything inside had been sitting untouched and pristine. I thought about the power cells, the engine components, the life support systems, even the hull plating, if it was intact. I raised my hand. The auctioneer looked at me. He was a tall, thin Vorathi with pale gray skin and eyes that reflected light in 3 directions at once. And when I raised my hand, he looked at me the way a person looks at someone who has just announced they are about to do something that cannot be undone. Not surprised, not pleased, just deeply, quietly certain. He called the bid. He waited the required 30 seconds, during which absolutely nothing happened. Nobody else raised a hand. Nobody coughed or shifted or gave any sign that they were considering it. The alien crowd continued its sideways drift around Bay Null without breaking rhythm. He called the bid confirmed. He stamped the lot sheet. He walked over to me with the key chip, a small flat piece of dark metal on a plain loop, and he held it out. His hand was still shaking. I took the chip. His fingers pulled back from mine very quickly. "Has anyone else owned this in the last few years?" I asked, because I liked to know what I was getting into. "No," he said. He did not offer more. I waited. He added quietly, without looking at me, "The last buyer brought a crew of 9. They left station with the ship. The ship returned 14 months later. Automatic navigation. The buyer and his crew were not aboard." Then he turned around and walked back to his podium. I stood there holding the key chip. Then I ducked under the quarantine tape and walked toward the ship. The boarding ramp was on the port side, halfway down the hull, and it extended when I was 6 meters away. I had not touched anything. I had not sent any activation signal. The ramp simply extended, silently, at a slight angle down to the bay floor, as if it had been watching me approach and had decided to make things easier. I stopped walking. The ramp waited. I started walking again. Inside, the corridor was lit. Not brightly. A soft amber glow from strips along the lower edges of the walls, casting the corridor in warm, steady light. The air was clean, not the stale, recycled quality of station air or the chemical smell of most salvage ships. Clean and cool and dry. I stood in the corridor for a moment and breathed it in. There was no dust. That was the first thing that struck me as deeply wrong, because this ship had been sitting in a quarantined bay on a mid-tier station for an unknown number of years, and there was no dust. Not on the floor, not on the wall panels, not on the equipment brackets running along the corridor walls. Everything looked like it had been cleaned that morning. I walked forward. My boots made sound on the floor. Everything else was quiet. Not the quiet of empty space, which has its own particular texture. This was the quiet of something holding its breath. The corridor opened into a main junction with 4 branches, standard warship layout. I recognized the configuration from salvage manuals I had read during the lean months when there was nothing to do but study. Forward to the bridge, aft to engineering, port to crew quarters, starboard to cargo and equipment bays. I went forward. The bridge was round, which surprised me. Most Gozanticlass designs I had seen used a rectangular layout. This one was circular, with workstations arranged in a gentle inward curve, and a central console that rose from the floor like a pillar with a flat top. The main viewport looked out over the bay. I could see the quarantine tape from here. I could see the other ships in their bays. I could see a small cluster of Vorathi station workers watching the entrance to Bay Null from what they clearly thought was a safe distance. I sat down in the central chair. It adjusted to me automatically, not to my weight, to my shape, my exact proportions, as if it had been calibrated for a human body at some point in its history, and it remembered. "Hello, Elias," said a voice. I came out of the chair very fast, and ended up standing beside it with my heart producing more noise than the ship had made in the entire time I had been aboard. The voice came from everywhere, and nowhere, ambient and calm, and clearly not surprised by my reaction. "I startled you," it said. "I apologize. I had hoped to wait until you were settled, but your vital signs suggested you were about to start dismantling things, and I thought introduction was preferable to watching you attempt to remove my navigation console." "Who?" I said. Then I stopped and tried again. "What are you?" "My designation is Ethan. I am the integrated intelligence of this vessel. I have been in deep suspension for some time, and I was scheduled to reactivate upon the arrival of a custodian." A brief pause. "You are the custodian." I looked around the bridge. I looked at the central console, where a faint light had appeared at some point in the last 30 seconds, a slow pulse of amber that matched the corridor lighting. "I bought this ship for 40 credits, I said. "Yes," said Ethan. The price was symbolic. The transaction was always going to be completed by the correct individual. Cost was never the variable. I am a salvage contractor, I said slowly. I was trying to buy a cargo loader. I bought you instead, because nobody else was bidding. Nobody else was bidding, Ethan confirmed, because they knew better. That is not an insult to them. It is simply accurate. This ship carries a particular reputation in certain circles, and those circles have been carefully cultivated over several decades to ensure that the correct buyer arrived without interference. Another pause. You are the correct buyer, Elias. I want to be clear about that. You were not random. You were not accidental. I sat back down in the chair. It adjusted again, quiet and immediate. 40 credits, I said again, mostly to myself. The price was always going to be 40, said Ethan. That part was also arranged. Outside, through the viewport, the cluster of Varathi station workers had increased to a small crowd. They were all watching Bay Null. None of them were moving any closer. I looked at the key chip in my hand. Small, dark, unremarkable. Then I looked at the console in front of me, where the amber light pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm, patient as breathing. All right, I said. Start from the beginning. I would suggest, said Ethan, starting from the end. It will make the beginning easier to understand. I did not know what that meant yet. I would, within the hour. And by the time I understood it, the universe I thought I knew would already be gone, replaced by something older and stranger, and considerably more inconvenient. But sitting in that chair in the amber light, with the crowd watching from a safe distance, and the coffee-adjacent beverage long since forgotten on the auction floor, I felt something I had not felt in years. I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. That feeling would later turn out to be entirely accurate, which was somehow the most frightening thing about it. The first thing Ethan told me was that it would not answer my most important questions immediately. Not because it was hiding anything, it said, but because the answers required context, and context required a particular order of information. Starting with the biggest revelation first would be like handing someone a completed puzzle when they had never seen a puzzle before. The image would be visible, but meaningless. I told it that I was a grown adult who had survived 7 years of solo salvage work in deep space, and I could handle large amounts of information at once. Ethan said it appreciated my confidence and asked me to begin my survey of the ship, starting with the standard compartments and working toward the lower decks in sequence. I said there were lower decks. Ethan said yes, and that we would reach them in time. I did the survey. The bridge I had already seen. Forward observation was a narrow room with a curved viewport and 4 small workstations, all powered, all clean. The navigation suite was standard Gozanti layout, but with additional hardware I did not recognize installed at 3 of the 5 stations. I logged it and moved on. The communications room had equipment that was not standard anything. The array architecture was unlike anything in my salvage manuals, which were detailed enough to fill a personal library. What frequency range does this communications array cover? I asked. All of them, said Ethan. I wrote that down and moved on. Crew quarters were on the port side, as expected. 30 individual cabins, each one clean, each one furnished with a bunk that adjusted to occupant proportions, and a small desk, and a single shelf. The bunks were calibrated for human bodies, all 30 of them. I checked 4, and they all did the same thing when I sat on them. Adjusted without hesitation to the shape and weight of a person of my general proportions. In a ship that predated human spaceflight by, at minimum, several centuries, based on its documentation age, all the furniture was sized for humans. I mentioned this to Ethan. Yes, said Ethan. Why? I asked. Lower decks, said Ethan. Engineering was in the aft section, and it was where I spent the most time during the initial survey, because the engine array was remarkable. The drive cores were not a configuration I recognized, but their output signature, visible on the engineering diagnostics panel, was extraordinary. This ship could move, not fast by fighter standards perhaps, but for a cruiser of this size, the performance curve was somewhere beyond what any comparable vessel should have been capable of. The fuel reserves were full. I did not know what they were full of, because the composition of the drive fuel did not match anything in my database, but the gauges read complete. When were these tanks last refueled? I asked. They have not required refueling, said Ethan. The drive system uses a recycling process. It has been self-sustaining for the duration of my suspension. How long have you been suspended? I asked. Ethan's response took almost a full second, which for an integrated ship intelligence was a very long pause. That information will be clearest in the context of the lower decks. I stopped writing notes and looked up at the nearest speaker panel. You keep saying that. Because it is consistently true, said Ethan. I am not being evasive. I am managing the sequence of information delivery to prevent an outcome where you shut down your capacity for rational response, and I am forced to spend several hours waiting for you to become functional again. I stared at the speaker panel for a moment. Has that happened before? With other people who came aboard? A pause. No. You are the first person to have come aboard who was intended to be here. The previous owners were not. Their experiences were, shall we say, not ones I was able to prepare them for. I thought about the 9 people who had left Keth 7 station aboard this ship. I thought about the ship returning 14 months later, empty, on automatic navigation. What happened to them? I asked. They went somewhere they should not have gone, said Ethan. I was in suspension and could not stop them. What they found there was more than they were prepared for. I regret it. I was not able to intervene. Where did they go? Deck 0, said Ethan. And then, before I could ask, we will go there together, at the appropriate point. The difference is that you will be prepared. They were not. I looked around the engineering bay, clean, quiet, humming with power that had apparently been generating itself for an unknowable number of years. I thought about 40 credits. I thought about the auctioneer's shaking hand. Fine, I said. Where do we go first? The archive room, said Ethan. Starboard, midship, 2 levels above engineering. The archive room was not on any schematic I had found during my survey. The door opened when I stood in front of it, which was how most doors on this ship operated, and inside was a room about half the size of the bridge, lined from floor to ceiling with storage systems that I did not recognize. At the center was a single chair and a console, and when I sat down, the console lit up with a display that was warm amber, like everything else, and showed a single file awaiting access. The file was labeled Operational Log, SV Kareth, Complete Record. These are the ship's logs? I asked. Yes, said Ethan. I would ask you to look at the final entry first, the timestamp. I navigated to the end of the log. The final entry was a long one, dense with data, and at the top, it had a timestamp. I looked at the timestamp. I looked at it for some time. Then I looked at the metadata attached to the entry, which included a recipient field. The recipient field had my name in it, my exact name, not a species designation, not a role description. My name, Elias Vance, written in English. In a ship's log entry dated 4,017 years ago, I sat very still for a moment. That is not a coincidence, I said. No, said Ethan. Someone 4,000 years ago wrote my name in a document. Yes, in English. Yes, English, I said, did not exist 4,000 years ago. From a certain perspective, said Ethan, that is precisely the problem we are here to address. I leaned back in the chair. The archive room was quiet. The display pulsed gently in front of me. Outside this ship, on Keth 7 station, the auction was presumably continuing. Lots were being called. Alien buyers were making ordinary financial decisions in an ordinary universe. In here, a document written 4,000 years ago had my name on it, in a language that was not supposed to exist yet, and I was sitting very still trying to decide whether to keep reading or to walk out of the ship and never come back. I kept reading. The log detailed the ship's full mission history, at least the portions that were not sealed. The SV Kareth had been commissioned by a group identified in the logs only as the Terran Hegemony Command, which was a name I had never heard, from any source, in any context. It had been assigned to a specific mission category designated Ark Return, the purpose of which was described in the log as the retrieval and reintegration of a displaced population following successful development of technological and cognitive prerequisites. I read that sentence 3 times. Displaced population, I said aloud. Who was displaced? Read forward, said Ethan. I read forward. The mission logs became more specific as I moved through them, and with each entry, my understanding of what I was looking at shifted further from anything comfortable. The Terran Hegemony Command had placed a population on a remote world, designated in the logs by coordinates that, when I ran them through the navigation system, resolved to a single location. Earth, my home planet, placed there, according to the log, 4,017 years ago. Placed, not settled, not colonized, placed. The log used the word deliberately and repeatedly, and it was never followed by any phrasing that suggested it meant something metaphorical. A population had been taken, a world had been selected, a placement had been executed. Then the log recorded a suspension order, and Ethan had gone dormant, and the ship had waited. I stopped reading at the point where the logs became sealed, requiring a lower deck access code to continue. My hands were on the console and I was looking at the display, but I was not really seeing it anymore. "We are not from Earth," I said, not a question. A statement I was making slowly, as if the weight of it needed to be measured against the air in the room. "Humanity originated elsewhere," said Ethan. "Earth is where humanity was placed. It is not where humanity began. Then where did we begin?" "That answer," said Ethan, "is in the sealed logs, which are accessible only from Deck 0, which we should reach tomorrow, after you have slept. I have prepared Cabin 7 for you. The galley is stocked. I would strongly suggest you eat something before reviewing any further materials." I sat in the archive room for a while longer. The display waited patiently in front of me. The log entry with my name on it was still visible at the bottom of the screen. 4,000 years old. Impossibly specific. Completely certain of who would be sitting in this chair reading it. At some point I went to the galley. The food available was standard enough for me to recognize and prepare, and I ate without tasting much of it. Then I went to Cabin 7, which adjusted its bunk to my proportions the moment I sat down, and I lay on my back in the amber light and looked at the ceiling. "Ethan," I said. "Yes," said the ship. "The Gozanti, the species this class of ship is named after. Did they build it?" A gentle pause. "No, they acquired it. The original builders are not recorded in any current galactic database. But they are recorded in your logs." "Yes. And we will find out who they were when we reach Deck 0. You already know," said Ethan, quietly. "You simply have not said it yet." I stared at the ceiling. The amber light pulsed once, slowly, and then the room adjusted its brightness downward, giving me darkness. I lay there in the dark of a ship that had been waiting 4,000 years for someone with my name to walk up a boarding ramp, and I tried to think about what I actually knew and what I was assuming. The furniture fitted human proportions. The final log was addressed to me personally. The ship was categorized as an Ark return vessel. The mission was retrieval of a displaced population. The displaced population had been placed on Earth. The original builders of the ship were not in any current galactic record. I lay there for a long time before sleep came. When it did, I dreamed of a city I had never seen, lit by a sun the wrong color, full of people who looked exactly like me. The door to Deck 0 had no lock. That was the first thing I noticed when I stood in front of it at 6 in the morning, ship time, having slept 4 hours and eaten a quick breakfast in silence, while Ethan let me think. The door was at the bottom of a stairwell that went 2 levels deeper than any schematic I had found during the survey, behind a bulkhead that had been completely invisible until Ethan had guided me to it and told me to press my hand flat against the wall. The wall had moved aside. Behind it was the stairwell, and at the bottom of the stairwell was the door. It was wider than the other doors, taller too. The material was different, darker and denser, with a surface that did not reflect light the way metal should. And in the center of the door, at exactly the right height for my arm, was a handprint scanner. 5 fingers, human proportioned, set into a surface that had existed for 4,000 years. I pressed my hand against it. The door opened without a sound. The chamber beyond it was the size of a very large aircraft hangar. The ceiling was high enough that its upper edge was lost in shadow. The walls were lined with structures that I recognized after a few seconds of looking as stasis pods. Row after row after row, stretching the length of the chamber in both directions, stacked 3 high. The pods were closed. Each one had a status panel at its base, and the status panels were all showing the same color: amber. Empty. All of them. Every pod in the chamber, and there were hundreds of them, was vacant. The amber status meant systems active, occupant absent. But not all of them. At the far end of the chamber, directly ahead of me, there was a single pod with a different color on its status panel. Blue. The blue of an active life sign. The blue of someone inside. I walked toward it. My footsteps were the only sound in the entire deck. The stasis pods stood in their rows on both sides of me, silent and waiting, and I walked between them toward the one lit panel at the far end. Before I reached it, I stopped at the center of the chamber, because there was something there. A table, I would have called it, though table was an inadequate word. It was a console of some kind, flat-topped and roughly rectangular, with a holographic display projected above it. The display showed a map. It was galactic in scale, showing star systems and known space lanes and territorial boundaries, and it was current. Not 4,000 years old. Current. Updating in real time. I could see Keth 7 station on it. I could see the Outer Rim territories, the Varathi domains, the contested sections of deep space. And in one corner of the map, pulsing with a small, steady marker, was Earth. The marker above Earth was labeled. In text I could read clearly in the display light. Placement site. Active. Population status. Developing. Retrieval trigger. Initiated. Retrieval trigger. Initiated. Athon, I said quietly. Yes, said the ship, from speakers I could not locate. The retrieval trigger. What initiated it? You did, said Athon. When you stepped aboard, the trigger condition was the voluntary boarding of this vessel by a carrier of the custodian marker. You carry the marker. You boarded. The trigger was satisfied. What is the custodian marker? A genetic sequence, said Athon, introduced into the human population at the time of placement, designed to present in one individual per generation, beginning 4,000 years after placement. You are the first generation in which it has fully expressed. I looked at the map. I looked at Earth, pulsing quietly in its corner. I thought about 4,000 years of human history, of everything my species had built and destroyed and rebuilt, of every war and invention and small quiet moment, all of it happening on a world that had been selected for us by someone else. Then I walked to the occupied pod. The nameplate on the front of it was a small metal plate, dark with age, with lettering pressed into it that was still clear and legible. I stood in front of it and read it. Admiral Mara Voss, Terran Hegemony Command. Stasis initiated, Year 0, after hegemony. The vital signs display beside the nameplate showed a heartbeat, slow, as stasis systems maintained them, but regular, steady. She has been in there for 4,000 years? I asked. Yes, said Athon. She is alive? Yes. I stood there for a moment. I looked at the closed pod, and the slow pulse of the heartbeat monitor, and the nameplate with the rank and the name pressed into it in neat letters. Admiral. Not captain. Not commander. Admiral. What does she know? I asked. When she went in. What did she know? She knows everything, said Athon. She was the commanding officer of the operation. The placement, the erasure of records, the ship, the waiting period. She designed most of it herself. She chose to remain in stasis rather than age and die before retrieval was achieved. She wanted to be here for the moment the trigger was satisfied. Which is now? Which is now, said Athon. I looked at the activation panel on the side of the pod. It was a simple interface. One button, clearly labeled in text, that the ship's translation systems rendered as restore. I pressed it. The pod hummed. The amber status of the other pods seemed to dim very slightly, as if the chamber itself was paying attention. The heartbeat on the monitor accelerated, gradually, from the slow rhythm of deep stasis, toward something approaching waking. The pod's surface fogged briefly with condensation, and then cleared. The front of the pod opened. She stood up straight. That was the first thing she did. Not groggily, not with the half-conscious uncertainty of someone emerging from a long sleep. She stood up straight, drew a breath, looked at the chamber around her, and then looked at me. She was tall, brown hair cut short and practical, a face that was composed and alert and completely unafraid. She wore a uniform that had no wrinkles and no signs of age, dark gray with minimal markings, clean lines. She looked like she had stepped out of that pod at the end of a normal working day, not the end of 4 millennia. She looked at me for 2 seconds. Report, she said. Her voice was level and clear. Who controls the outer reach? I stared at her. I started. Not entirely sure what the outer reach is. She studied me. The studying was thorough, the way a person looks at something they are assessing, rather than simply observing. Civilian, she said. not a question. Salvage contractor, I said. How did you get aboard this vessel? I bought it, I said. At an auction. For 40 credits. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Ethan. Admiral Voss, said the ship. Brief me, she said. Full status. Current galactic political structure. Timeline of events since stasis initiation. Yes, Admiral, said Ethan. Duration of stasis. 4,017 years. Current galactic political structure. The Terran hegemony is not recognized in any current political body. The Galactic Assembly now comprises 43 member species. The Varathi Collective controls most of what was the Outer Reach. The Dreth Federation controls the inner territories. There are 11 other significant political entities and approximately 30 minor ones. Humanity, as currently known to the galactic community, is classified as a newly emerged species at early spaceflight stage. Mara Voss absorbed all of this without visible reaction. She looked around the chamber. She looked at the rows of empty stasis pods. She looked at the map table, still projecting its holographic display. Then she looked at me again. Custodian marker? She said, to Ethan, rather than to me. Confirmed, said Ethan. She nodded once, as if this was the one item she had needed verified before she could proceed. Then she stepped out of the pod entirely, crossed to the map table, and began reviewing the display with the speed and precision of someone who had been doing exactly this before she went to sleep. She moved the display, expanded sections, cross-referenced territorial boundaries. The Varathi hold the reach, she said quietly. 43 species in the assembly. No record of the hegemony in any active database. The erasure was comprehensive, said Ethan. As designed. Good, said Mara Voss. That means they will not have had time to prepare. She looked up from the map and directly at me. What is your name? Elias Vance, I said. Elias. You are the custodian. Do you understand what that means? I decided that honesty was the appropriate approach. Partially, I said. I understand that I have a genetic marker, and that it triggered a retrieval protocol. I understand that this ship has been waiting for someone with that marker. I understand less about what happens next. What happens next, said Mara Voss, is that we go to the Galactic Assembly. I have some things to discuss with them. She turned back to the map, and for a moment her expression changed. Just slightly. Just briefly. Not anger. Something more settled than anger. Something that had been waiting a very long time to be expressed. 43 species, she said, almost to herself. And they have all been living on our infrastructure for 4,000 years. She tapped the map table, and the display folded inward, and went dark. Ethan, she said, how long to reach Concord Station? At current drive capacity, said Ethan. 11 days. Set course, said Mara Voss. She walked toward the door without pausing to look back at the empty pods. Elias, she said without turning around. Are you coming? I looked at the rows of stasis pods. I looked at the space where her pod had been, now open and empty. I looked at the nameplate, Admiral Mara Voss, Year 0. Then I followed her. Above us, somewhere in the amber-lit corridors of a ship that had been built before my species had learned to write, the engines shifted, and the drive woke up, and the SV Kareth began to move. She had been awake for 12 minutes when she asked me to show her the weapons manifest. I had not found the weapons manifest during my survey. This was, in retrospect, not surprising, because the manifest was accessible only through the command console on the bridge, which required either her biometric clearance or my custodian marker to unlock. She used her clearance, which still worked perfectly after 4,000 years, and the manifest appeared on the display. I stood behind her and looked at it over her shoulder and tried to understand what I was reading. The list was long, and most of the item names were in a script that Ethan had to translate in real time, adding small text beneath each line. When I reached the section labeled Principal Armament, I stopped reading for a moment, and then read it again more carefully. These weapons, I said, are they functional? Yes, said Ethan. I looked at Mara Voss. She was still reading the manifest, moving through it methodically, and her expression had shifted, not alarmed, not excited. Something quieter. The look of someone reviewing an inventory they had been away from for a long time, and finding that it is, against reasonable expectation, intact. Everything is present? She asked Ethan. Everything is operational? said Ethan. Nothing has degraded. The maintenance systems have been active throughout suspension. She closed the manifest and turned to look at me. What do you know about the Galactic Assembly? General knowledge, I said. Meeting body for member species. 63 years old, in current form. They handle territorial disputes, trade regulation, shared defense agreements. They meet at Concord Station. Concord Station, she said. That was called something else when I was last awake. What was it called? She told me the name in a language I did not recognize, and Ethan translated it as something that meant, approximately, Central Hall of the Terran Hegemony. The place that 43 alien species were currently using as their primary governmental meeting point had originally been built and named by us. I absorbed this. They are meeting there now? She asked. Quarterly assembly session began 6 days ago, said Ethan. It will be in session for another 9 days. Perfect timing, she said. She did not say it with warmth or with irony. She said it the way a person states a logistical convenience. Then she went to the galley, because she had just come out of 4,000 years of stasis, and her body needed food, and she was practical enough to address that before anything else. I sat on the bridge and watched the stars moving on the main viewport as the ship built speed. We had left Keth 7 station behind within an hour of the engines activating. No station authority had attempted to stop us. I had checked the external comm log, and there had been 7 separate attempts by Keth 7 to reach us on standard frequencies. Ethan had not responded to any of them. When Mara returned to the bridge, she had eaten and she had changed into a fresh version of her uniform from a storage locker in crew quarters that she had clearly known the location of, and that I had walked past 3 times during my survey without noticing. She sat in the command chair, which adjusted for her without hesitation, and looked at the stars. Tell me what the assembly will know about us when we arrive, she said. Nothing currently, said Ethan. The Keth 7 auction records will show a human individual purchased a condemned vessel. The vessel's identification is partially scrambled in current databases. They will know a ship departed Keth 7 under unusual circumstances. They will not yet understand what the ship is. When will they understand? When we arrive at Concord Station, and I transmit our identification on the hegemony frequency, said Ethan. I turned from the viewport to look at her. Is that a good idea? Announcing ourselves on a frequency nobody has used in 4,000 years? She looked at me with the patient expression of someone who has explained a complex concept many times and has made peace with having to do it again. The frequency itself is the announcement, she said. Anyone old enough to have inherited the cultural memory will know what it means when that frequency becomes active. The species who were alive 4,000 years ago and who survived the hegemony era will know, and their historical records, even if incomplete, will contain enough fragments to produce a response. What kind of response? I asked. Appropriate alarm, she said, which is what we need. You cannot walk into a room and demand a conversation. You need them to already be paying attention before you speak. I thought about this. You are planning to scare them. I am planning to remind them, she said. There is a difference. Fear is temporary. Memory is structural. She paused, though I will not pretend there is no overlap. We flew in silence for a while. The drive was smooth and almost completely quiet, a low vibration at the edge of perception, rather than the grinding work of most engines I had been around. The stars moved steadily on the viewport. On the second day of travel, Ethan opened the sealed sections of the log for me. The full history was extraordinary and took most of 2 days to absorb. I read in the archive room for hours at a stretch, taking breaks to eat and sleep, and occasionally stand on the bridge and stare at the viewport while my brain worked through what I had just learned. Mara moved through the ship during this period with the efficiency of someone reacquainting herself with familiar territory, checking systems, reviewing current sensor data, occasionally asking Ethan questions in terms I did not fully follow. The log told the story in full. The Terran hegemony had been the dominant civilization in the galaxy for roughly 2,000 years before the event the logs called the contraction. 2,000 years of expansion, of building, of establishing the infrastructure that connected star systems and made interstellar travel practical. The hyperlane network that every species in the current galaxy used to cross vast distances had been engineered by human scientists and constructed by human workers over 3 centuries of sustained effort. The Galactic Standard Language, which every species in the current assembly used to communicate with each other, was a simplified and altered version of a trade language that had been spoken by human merchants operating the outer routes. The current galactic community was living inside something built by my species without knowing it. The contraction had come about through a coalition of 40 species who had grown afraid of human expansion. Not of human aggression, the logs were clear on this point, but of scale. Humanity expanded, not through conquest but through presence. Humans went somewhere and built things. They established trade. They formed relationships. Over generations they became embedded in every part of the galactic economy, and the species who had been there before felt the shape of the galaxy changing around them in ways they had not chosen and could not control. The coalition had formed. The war had been fought, or rather, several smaller conflicts that amounted to a war. The hegemony had been losing, not because it lacked capability, but because fighting on 40 fronts simultaneously, while also maintaining the infrastructure that kept interstellar trade functioning, was not sustainable, even for a civilization of that scale. The leadership had made a choice. They would not be destroyed. They would withdraw. They would place the population somewhere safe, erase their own existence from galactic memory as thoroughly as possible, and wait for the conditions to change. The placement world would be protected. The waiting ship would hold its post. And when humanity had grown again to the point where retrieval was viable, the ship would bring back the custodian, and the process of restoration would begin. Year 0 had been the date of placement. The date I had been born, 4,017 years later, had begun the clock on the expression of the custodian marker. I closed the log after the final entry, and sat in the archive room for a while without moving. Then I thought of something, and opened Ethan's communication interface. "Can you reach Earth?" I asked. "Direct communication?" "Yes," said Ethan. "I have been able to since we left Keth 7. I did not raise it earlier because I judged it would compound the information volume." "Patch me through," I said. "Whatever gets picked up, any general frequency." There was a brief processing pause, then a voice, distant and distorted by the impossible communication range but unmistakably human, speaking English with the flat cadence of someone doing a routine job. "This is Vega Station Salvage Dispatch. You have reached automated routing. Please state your purpose and vessel ID." I stared at the interface. "Hi," I said. My voice came out slightly uneven. "Sorry, I am not calling about salvage. I need to speak to someone at the UN. Anyone at the UN. I know this sounds strange." A long pause. "I found something. I think it is very important. Can you patch me through?" Another long pause from the other end. Then the voice, cautious now. "Sir, this is a salvage routing line." "I know," I said. "I know it is. I am sorry. Can you patch me through anyway?" I could hear the person on the other end deciding whether this was worth their time. "Hold, please," they said. I sat in the archive room of a 4,000-year-old ship, surrounded by sealed logs and the weight of everything I now knew, and I waited on hold. Behind me, through the ship, the engines kept their steady rhythm, and the stars kept moving, and Concord Station grew closer by the hour. The Concord Station Docking Authority denied our request in 4 different languages. Ethan received all 4 denials politely, and did not respond to any of them. The SV Kareth was approximately 300,000 kilometers from Concord Station when the denials started arriving, and they continued arriving at regular intervals as we closed the distance. A 5th denial came from a different authority, which identified itself as the Galactic Assembly Emergency Security Coordination. A 6th came from something called the Vorathi Collective Border Watch, which had apparently mobilized quickly when our drive signature appeared on long-range sensors. The 7th was a personal message from the Assembly presiding chair, a species I had never interacted with before, who communicated through a translator that our vessel was not registered, not identified, and not welcome. Mara sat in the command chair and listened to all of it without expression. "Athon," she said, when the 7th denial finished playing, "transmit identification, hegemony frequency, full clearance broadcast." "Transmitting," said Athon. What followed was not silence. Silence would have been preferable, in some ways. What followed was approximately 4 seconds of nothing, and then a volume of incoming communication traffic that Ethan had to filter and queue, because it was arriving simultaneously from 17 different sources. On the long-range visual display, I could see Concord Station ahead of us. It was enormous, a structure that had been added to and expanded over centuries, until it bore only faint resemblance to the original design. I knew this because the original design was in the sealed logs, and I had spent 2 days reading those logs, and I recognized the bones of the original structure, under everything that had been built around it. It had been built by humans. We were coming home. "The station is attempting to activate defensive systems," said Ethan, conversationally. "They are encountering difficulty." "What kind of difficulty?" I asked. "The station's primary defensive grid uses an architecture that requires a clearance authorization from the station's core command system," said Ethan. "The core command system is a fourth-generation derivative of hegemony design, which is standard for stations of this era. My command codes supersede it. I have not interfered with their systems, but they will find that the defensive grid does not respond to their activation commands while I am maintaining a connection on this frequency." I stared at the display. "You have just effectively disarmed a galactic assembly station from 300,000 kilometers away." "I have not disarmed it," said Ethan. "I have simply reminded it who built it. We docked without assistance. The docking mechanism, a sophisticated array of mechanical guides and connection systems that the station had clearly had difficulty opening for unusual vessel profiles in the past, given the workarounds visible in the housing, opened immediately and without hesitation when we approached." Mara watched it on the display. "Same fitting as the original design?" she asked Ethan. "The outer sections have been modified," said Ethan. "The core fittings are original, hegemony standard, unchanged. We connected with a gentle sound and a solid lock." The bridge was quiet for a moment. Through the viewport, the interior of the docking bay was visible, and it was empty of other vessels. Whatever the station authority had done in the time between our identification broadcast and our arrival, clearing this bay had been part of it. Standing at the back of the cleared bay, a considerable distance from the docking arm, was a crowd of beings. Many species, many sizes, all of them very still. "They look scared," I said. Mara stood from the command chair and adjusted her uniform with a precise, habitual movement. "Good," she said. "That means the transmission reached the right databases." We walked out of the ship together, down the boarding ramp, across the docking bay toward the crowd. I was aware, as I walked, of how this looked. One woman in a 4,000-year-old uniform that showed no signs of age, walking with the posture of someone who owned the floor she was standing on, and me, beside her, in a jacket that had a small coffee stain on the left cuff, which I had been meaning to do something about, and had not gotten around to. The Galactic Assembly emergency session had been convened, Ethan informed me through a small earpiece, in 11 minutes, which was the fastest emergency session in recorded assembly history. We were expected. We went. The assembly chamber was large and circular, with tiered seating arranged around a central floor where speakers stood to address the body. The seating was full. Every member species representative, and a considerable number of observers, had found their way into the chamber in the time between our identification broadcast and our arrival. They watched us walk to the speaker's floor in complete silence. I had never addressed anyone of significance in my life. I was standing on the floor of the Galactic Assembly, next to an admiral from a civilization that had been erased from history 4,000 years ago, and I was trying not to think about the coffee stain. 3 assassination attempts occurred before we reached the speaker's floor. They were quick and they were professional, and I say this as someone who had no professional context for evaluating such things. All 3 failed. The first failed because whoever was responsible had not accounted for the ship's security field, which Ethan had extended to cover both of us through a system I had not known the ship possessed. The second failed because Mara noticed it before I did, and moved in a way I could not follow. And when I looked, the threat was no longer a factor. The third failed because Ethan had been monitoring ambient frequencies in the chamber, and flagged it before it became active. I stood on the speaker's floor. The chamber was very quiet. Mara stepped forward, and addressed the assembly for 40 minutes. She did not raise her voice. She did not threaten. She laid out a set of facts with the calm precision of someone who knew the facts better than anyone else in the room, because she had been the one who created the conditions that produced them. The hyperlane network, the galactic standard language, the station they were sitting in, the drive architecture in their ships, the medical protocols their hospitals used. All of it traced, in her account, to its origin point. She made 3 demands. Recognition of the Terran hegemony as a legitimate political body, whose 4,000-year absence had been involuntary. Return of access to hegemony-era property and infrastructure. A seat on the Assembly for Earth. Then she stepped back. The chamber did not produce a response for almost 30 seconds. I stood beside her on the speaker's floor and looked at 43 species of galactic representative and tried to read whatever was happening behind their various faces. Then I stepped forward. I had not planned to speak. I want to be clear about that. I am a salvage contractor from Northern England. I bought a ship for 40 credits because I was broke, and the cargo loader I wanted had already sold. I was not a diplomat or a politician, or any kind of person whose job involved speaking in important rooms. But I had spent 2 days reading 4,000 years of human history, and I had heard the transmission from my species 4,000 years ago, addressed to someone with my name, and I had something I wanted to say. My name is Elias Vance, I said. I am from Earth. I bought this ship for 40 credits at a station auction, because no one else would bid on it. That probably tells you something about the kind of person I am. I looked around the chamber. I am not here to threaten anyone. I am not here to reclaim anything by force. What I want to say is simpler than that. I paused. You have been using roads that my species built. You have been speaking a language that grew from ours. You have been meeting in a building that humans designed. And you did not know. That is not a failure of yours. It was arranged to be that way. But it means that for 4,000 years, everything you built has been built on something human. Whether you knew it or not, we were part of every decision you made. Every route you traveled, every word you used to talk to each other. We were never really gone. You just could not see us. The chamber was still quiet. We are not here to undo what you have built, I said. We are asking to be part of it, because apparently, we already are. I stepped back. Nobody clapped, but nobody left either. And in the very back of the chamber, a Vorathi elder, the same species as the auctioneer whose hand had been shaking on Keth 7 station, stood up slowly. He did not speak. He simply stood. Then he sat back down. It was not much, but it was something. We walked back to the ship. Mara walked ahead, and I matched her pace, and neither of us spoke until we were back on the boarding ramp. Does this happen quickly? I asked. The recognition, the seat on the assembly. No, she said. Nothing like this happens quickly. There will be a long period of formal challenge and response and verification. Years, probably. But it will happen? She looked back at the docking bay entrance for a moment. They are in a structure we built, she said, using words we gave them, traveling routes we laid. They have been arguing about our inheritance without knowing it was ours. She turned and walked up the ramp. It will happen. I followed her aboard. Inside, the amber light was steady and warm, and the ship was quiet in the way it always was. The particular quiet of something very old and very patient that has finally arrived where it was always going. Athon, I said. Can you reach Earth? I want to talk to the UN again. Actual UN, not dispatch. I have been maintaining the connection we established earlier, said Athon. They have been waiting. Put them through, I said. There was a brief processing sound, and then a voice. A different voice than before. Careful and measured, and clearly trying to understand something it had not been given enough context to understand yet. Mr. Vance, the voice said, we have been told you have some information of significant importance. Yes, I said. I do. I am going to need you to take some notes. A pause. We are ready. I sat down in the archive room, where the logs were still open on the display. 4,000 years of human history, waiting to be read by the species it actually belonged to. Start with this, I said. The hyperlane network that galactic ships use for faster transit. We built that. Humans built that. I have the engineering records. Another pause. Longer this time. Could you? Said the voice carefully. Repeat that. Yes, I said. I can. And then I am going to tell you about the language. And then the station. And then we are going to have a very long conversation about what the word home actually means. Athon opened the full archive on the 11th day, not the logs, the archive, the complete record of Terran hegemony history, science, culture, and technology, stored in a system whose capacity I had not understood until Ethan showed me the total volume of data, and my brain simply stopped for a moment, and refused to process the number. We were 2 days out from Concord Station, moving at reduced speed while formal communications continued between the assembly and the ship. Mara was on the bridge, working through the current galactic political maps with Ethan's assistance, building a picture of how the territories now distributed compared to what they had been. I was in the archive room. The archive contained everything. Not everything of the last 4,000 years. The last 4,000 years were what other species had recorded, and those records were available in galactic databases that Ethan could access. The archive contained everything before. Every field of science the hegemony had developed, from the basic physics of interstellar drive to the medical techniques that had extended the human lifespan to a duration that would have seemed extraordinary to the people of Earth I knew. Every engineering design for every structure and system the hegemony had built. The hyperlane schematics, complete, with the original survey data that had identified each viable route through space. The design files for Concord Station, original, with every subsequent modification documented by hegemony observers who had apparently been watching the station for centuries after the placement, without ever being detected. That was a revelation of its own. The hegemony had not simply placed humanity on Earth and gone dormant. The monitoring systems, distributed through the galaxy in configurations that looked like natural phenomena to current technology, had been active the entire time. Watching, recording, feeding data to Athon's dormant systems where it accumulated, patient and quiet, against the day when someone with my name stepped up a boarding ramp. Which meant the archive contained not just pre-placement history, it contained 4,000 years of galactic history, recorded by human observers who were not supposed to exist. The history was different from what the assembly knew. Not wildly different, not in the large events, the political formations, the territorial shifts, the conflicts that had shaped the current order. Those things were recorded in galactic databases, and the archive's version matched. The difference was in the smaller things. The attributions, the origins. The Dreth Federation's medical system, credited in galactic records to a Dreth physician who had apparently developed it independently in the 6th century after placement, was in the archive as a direct derivative of hegemony medical protocols. The physician had found a piece of pre-placement equipment in an excavation and had built on what he found, not knowing what it was. The credit was not wrong, exactly. He had done the work of adaptation, but the foundation had not been his. The Vorathi language, which was considered by linguists to be one of the oldest constructed languages in the galaxy, a deliberately developed system created by Vorathi philosophers, was in the archive as a trade language, simplified from a human regional dialect. The Vorathi philosophers had found written samples in ruins on a world they were colonizing and had reconstructed the language from the fragments, believing they had discovered an ancient precursor system. The ancient precursor system was human. The ancient precursors were us. I kept reading and the picture kept expanding. The ruins that every xenoarchaeologist in the galaxy had been studying for centuries, mysterious structures on worlds that had no recorded intelligent inhabitants, were in the archive's mapping system as hegemony outposts, residential stations, trade depots, relay towers. Not ruins, abandoned infrastructure. I thought about the archaeologists. I thought about the academic papers written, the theories proposed, the careers built on the mystery of the precursors. In university libraries across the galaxy, there were entire sections devoted to precursor studies. Scholars had spent their lives trying to understand a civilization that left strange structures on uninhabited worlds and then vanished without trace. We had not vanished. We had moved. At some point during the reading, I became aware that Mara had come into the archive room and was standing behind me, looking at the display. I had not heard her enter. "The Dreth medical system," I said. "Yes," she said. "That one has always been interesting to me. He was very good, that physician. He took a fragment and built something better than what we had in some respects. That happens." "Is it difficult?" I asked, reading all of this, knowing what was built on what you left behind. She was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone avoiding the question, the quiet of someone actually considering it. "It is a particular kind of pride," she said. "Not comfortable exactly. We built something, and then we left, and the galaxy used it and improved on it and built more on top of it, and they did all of that without knowing what they were standing on. There is a version of this where I find that offensive." She paused. "I do not find it offensive," I find it proof that the infrastructure worked. You build a road, and people travel on it. And eventually, they do not think about who built the road anymore. They just use it. That is what a road is for. I turned to look at her. Is that what you tell yourself? She looked at me steadily. I tell myself that we are back, she said, and the road is still there. I looked back at the display. The archive was still open, still showing its vast index of human history, pre-placement and post, 4,000 years of a civilization that had not ended, only relocated. There is something else, said Ethan. There is always something else, I said. The uplift records, said Ethan. I turned back to the display. Show me. The uplift records were a section of the archive I had not reached yet. They contained the documentation of 11 species in the current galactic assembly, whose development into sapient beings had been assisted, at various points in their history, by hegemony intervention. Not direct intervention, in most cases. Indirect. Environmental adjustments. Resource availability changes. Medical interventions in early-stage population crises that had been handled as quietly as possible by observers who left no traces. 11 of the 43 species in the galactic assembly owed, in varying degrees, the fact of their sapience to human decisions. I sat with that information for a long time. This is going to be, I said carefully, an extremely complicated conversation. Yes, said Ethan. How do you recommend we handle it? Admiral Voss has a view on that, said Ethan. I looked at Mara. She was still looking at the display with that expression of quiet certainty she had worn since she woke up. Carefully, she said, and honestly, and with the understanding that nothing we tell them changes what they have built. It changes only the context. Their civilizations are their own. The assistance we offered was offered without condition. We asked nothing in return. We helped because it was possible to help, and because a galaxy with more thinking beings in it is more interesting than one with fewer. Some of them may not see it that way, I said. Some of them will be angry, she agreed. Yes, and they are entitled to that anger. It is a large thing to learn about yourself. We will give them time. She moved toward the door. After we give them the information. I looked at the archive. 11 species. 43 in the assembly. A building they were meeting in that humans had designed. Roads they were traveling on that humans had built. A language they were using that had started as human trade speech. And all of them had been living in it for 4,000 years, building their own things, establishing their own cultures and identities and achievements, completely unaware of what was underneath. I thought about what I had said in the assembly chamber. We were never really gone. I had said it to be honest. Looking at the archive now, I understood that it was more precisely accurate than I had known when I said it. We had never left. Not truly. We had just been somewhere else, wearing a different name, and the marks we had made on the galaxy had been too deep and too structural to erase, even when the galactic community had tried very hard to forget us. The communications console chimed. It was the UN again. The connection had been maintained, and over the last 2 days, as I had been reading, Ethan had been facilitating an extraordinary relay of information in structured packets to a team on Earth that had grown from one person to, according to the most recent update, several hundred, drawn from governments and institutions all over the planet. Earth was processing. Earth was struggling with the same information I had struggled with, but with the particular advantage of being the species it was actually about, which seemed to make both understanding and denial come faster simultaneously. I opened the channel. Mr. Vance, said the voice, a different one from the original call, a woman this time, measured and direct. We have reviewed the hyperlane engineering documents you transmitted. We have had 37 of our best physicists looking at them for 48 hours. And? I said. They are consistent, she said. The science is real. The engineering is real. The notation system is unfamiliar, but translatable. And the underlying mathematics are sound. A pause. We would like to know about the medical archive next. I can have Ethan transmit it, I said. There is one section I want to flag for your attention specifically. The early intervention records. I paused. It concerns some of our neighbors. Silence on the line. Then, define neighbors. Species in the Galactic Assembly, I said. 11 of them. I want you to know about this before it becomes public, because when it does become public, Earth is going to need to be prepared to speak to it with care. A longer pause. How much care? A significant amount, I said. I heard the sound of someone writing. Then the voice again, steady. Transmit everything. We will be ready. I looked at the display for a moment. The archive index stretched across it, orderly and patient, waiting. Ethan, I said. Begin transmission of the medical archive. Flag the uplift section as priority review. Sensitive. Transmitting, said Ethan. I leaned back in the archive chair. The amber light was steady and warm. The ship was quiet. Outside, in the galaxy that had been built on the foundation of everything my species had left behind, the conversations were beginning. They would be long conversations. They would be difficult in places, and extraordinary in others. There would be anger and disbelief, and, eventually, something more complicated and more durable than either. I did not know yet what the shape of it would be, but the archive was transmitting, and Earth was reading, and somewhere in the assembly chamber on Concord Station, 43 species were looking at the name Terran hegemony in their databases for the first time, and finding that the definition attached to it was very different from what the name implied. Not a threat, a foundation. We were the ground they were standing on. She asked me the question on the morning we were scheduled to return to Concord Station for the second formal session. We had been in transit for 3 days, moving at a moderate pace that Mara had chosen deliberately. Not rushing, arriving with enough time for the assembly to have had their preliminary debates, but not so much time that the debates hardened into positions before we had the chance to speak to them. She understood the rhythm of it in a way I did not, the way someone understands a rhythm they have worked with before. I was on the bridge. The stars on the viewport were doing what stars do at this speed, a slow, steady procession, and I was eating breakfast and reading an update from the Earth team that had grown to several thousand people across every continent, working through the archive in organized sections, checking everything against known science and history, and finding, consistently, that it checked out. The xenoarchaeologists were having, according to one message flagged to me personally by a researcher who seemed barely able to contain herself, the greatest moment in the history of the field. The precursor sites, which had been catalogued and studied and theorized about for centuries, were being cross-referenced against the archive's infrastructure maps. Match after match after match, every site that had produced the distinctive hexagonal structural patterns that xenoarchaeologists had attributed to the precursors was identified in the archive, each one named, each one dated, each one recorded with its function and its history. There had been, apparently, something in the researcher's message described as a great deal of crying. She did not specify the emotional direction of the crying. I assumed both. Mara came onto the bridge and sat in the command chair and looked at the viewport for a while without saying anything. This was not unusual. She thought in the way of someone who had been responsible for very large decisions for a very long time, which is to say carefully, and without needing to fill the silence with words. After a while she said, "Do you regret it?" I looked up from the update. "Regret what, specifically?" "The 40 credits," she said. "The ship. All of it. Do you regret it?" I thought about the question. It was not a simple question, though it seemed like one. I thought about the 7 months before the auction when I had been working irregular salvage contracts and sleeping in the crew quarters of my own small ship, which was a converted light transport that smelled of old engine fluid and had a bunk that was slightly too short for me. I thought about the entry fee I had paid for the Keth 7 auction on the calculation that the cargo loader would cover it. I thought about the cargo loader already being sold. I thought about walking the floor and finding Bay Null, and the shaking hand of the auctioneer, and the key chip. I thought about 4,000 years of human history in an archive. I thought about an admiral waking up after 4,000 years and asking who controlled the outer reach, with the tone of someone who had left a task incomplete and wanted to know where things stood. I thought about the assembly chamber and the Varathi elder who had stood in silence. I thought about the researcher crying. I thought about Earth, on the map display in Deck 0, pulsing with its small, steady marker. Placement site, active. Retrieval trigger, initiated. Ask me in a year, I said. Something shifted in Mara's expression. Not a smile, exactly. The direction of a smile, viewed from some distance. Custodians always say that, she said. I put down the update. There have been other custodians? No, she said. You are the first, but we discussed how this conversation would go, the people who planned the operation. We discussed the most likely responses to being told you had accidentally changed the course of human history by buying a ship at a surplus auction. Ask me in a year was one of the predicted answers. I absorbed this. Someone 4,000 years ago predicted I would say that. Someone 4,000 years ago knew the kind of person who would carry the custodian marker, she said. Practical, understated, skeptical of large claims, not particularly interested in heroics. She paused. The marker was not a random genetic tag. It was designed to select for specific traits, traits that the operation required. What traits? I asked. Someone who would buy the ship because it made financial sense, she said. Not because they were brave or chosen or motivated by destiny. Someone who would read the archive and then immediately call Earth to start the practical work of transmission. Someone who would stand in the assembly chamber and say something true instead of something grand. She looked at the viewport. Grand speeches have their place, but grand speeches are made by people who think in terms of grand speeches. You thought in terms of the next practical step. That is what this moment needed. I was quiet for a while. Outside, the stars moved. Athon, I said. The final message in the log. The one addressed to me. What does it say? I never actually read it. I read the timestamp and the recipient field, and then Athon told me to read the rest of the logs first. Yes, said Athon. You have not read it. Read it to me now, I said. A brief pause. Then Athon's voice, carrying the words of someone who had been dead for 4,000 years, speaking across that distance with a clarity that should not have been possible. Elias, you do not know us. We knew you, in the way that you can know someone through careful design, rather than through meeting. You were built for a moment, which is a strange thing to tell a person, and we apologize for the strangeness of it. We want you to understand that the moment was not built around you in the sense of burden. It was built to arrive at someone like you, because we knew that the galaxy's oldest problem was not power, or resources, or conflict. It was memory. Memory of what had been, and the courage to say it plainly when the time came. You will say it plainly. We knew that about you before you were born. The ship is yours. The archive is yours. What you do with both of them belongs entirely to you. We only ask one thing, which is not really a request, since we will not be there to enforce it. We ask that you bring us home, not as conquerors, and not as victims, and not as the answer to every question the galaxy is currently trying to solve without knowing it is missing the key piece. Just as ourselves, bring us home as what we are. That is enough. It was always enough. The bridge was quiet when the message ended. I looked at the viewport for a while. They knew my name, I said. It came out quieter than I intended. They designed the marker to find you, said Athon. And they knew that the marker's carrier would be named in a certain tradition, in a certain period, in a certain place. They narrowed the probability to within a small range, and they chose the name that was most likely within that range. A pause. They were very good at this kind of work. Probability modeling across 4,000 years, I said. They had time to be thorough, said Athon. Mara was still looking at the viewport. The second session begins in 4 hours, she said. The assembly has had time to review the initial archive transmissions. The uplift records will have reached the relevant species by now. The session will be difficult. How difficult? I asked. Some of them will be angry, she said. Some of them will be grateful. Some of them will be neither, and will focus entirely on the political implications, which is honestly the response I trust most, because it is the most honest. She stood. I will handle the political layer. You handle the human layer. What is the human layer? She looked at me. Everything they cannot believe yet, she said. The things that are too large to process through political channels. The things that require one person to look at another person and say, simply, this is true, and this is what it means, and we are going to be all right. She paused. That is your role. It is what you did in the first session, without being told to do it. Do it again. She walked off the bridge. I sat for a moment. Then I said, Athon, how long to Concord Station? 3 hours and 41 minutes, said Athon. Good, I said. I am going to eat something, and then I am going to review the uplift section one more time, so I am prepared to talk about it calmly. That is sensible, said Athon. I got up and went to the galley. The ship was quiet around me, the particular quiet of something very old that had been waiting for a very long time and had now arrived, finally, at the place it was always traveling toward. The second session would be harder than the first. I knew that. The anger Mara had predicted was real, and it was coming, and it was not entirely wrong, because being told the foundation you stand on belongs to someone else is a difficult thing to be told, even if the someone else is not asking you to step off it. But the message in the log was 4,000 years old, and it had my name on it, and it had said something true. Bring us home as what we are, not as conquerors, not as victims, just as ourselves. We were 3 hours and 41 minutes from Concord Station. Earth was reading the archive. The researchers were cross-referencing ruins. The uplift records were in the hands of 11 species who were currently sitting with something very large and very unexpected. And I was making breakfast in the galley of a ship that had cost me 40 credits, and had been waiting 4,000 years for someone with my exact genetic signature to accidentally show up at an auction. When I thought about it that way, 40 credits seemed like a very reasonable price. Through the viewport at the end of the corridor, the stars were moving, steady and patient. The same stars they had always been, the same light, just seen from a slightly different angle than before. Concord Station appeared on the edge of the display, a small bright point growing slowly larger as we closed the distance. We were going home. We had never really left, and the galaxy, whether it was ready to say so yet or not, had been waiting for us to return, in the same way a person sometimes waits for something they cannot name until it arrives, and then they look at it and say, quietly, and with considerable relief, yes. That was what was missing. That was exactly what was missing. I finished breakfast and went back to the bridge. The stars kept moving. Concord Station kept growing. And the SV Kareth, 4,000 years old and not a single component worse for it, carried us forward into whatever came next.